Now, we've talked about this concept of the crowding out effect many times in previous lectures, but we never quite got to the analysis of why the crowding out effect actually happens. So, in this video, we're going to look at why the crowding out effect actually happens. Now, we know that the crowding out effect occurs when a budget deficit is run, and it occurs because public sector spending in a way depresses private sector spending. And this isn't spending on, consumer goods and services such as like coffee or like minor goods and services, but these are generally very large spending, large purchases. Because the crowding out effect, as we know, affects interest rates. And by extension, affects interest rates. And then by extension, discretionary income. Discretionary income. Okay. So this would only occur, we must note, if the government borrows from the private sector. So when it takes away from national savings. So we're going to look at this in terms of our supply and demand analysis yet again. Okay. So we have supply and demand. We have on the y-axis price, but instead of price, we're going to look at this in terms of R, or the real interest rate. So interest rate minus inflation. So R equals the nominal interest rate minus inflation. This is also called the Fisher equation. But we don't have to worry about the Fisher equation for now. We're just going to know that the price, in this case, is again the real interest rate. And the x-axis, which was previously the quantity, is now going to be either national savings or investment. And since we know at equilibrium national savings equals investment, we can just talk about this as the quantity of savings available in the economy. Now we have an upward sloping national savings curve because as the real interest rate increases, we can see that people would tend to save more and therefore add to national savings. And again, we have a downward sloping demand curve, but in this case, demand is investment. So the demand for savings comes from investment expenditure by firms. And prior to this change in national savings, we have an equilibrium, well, we've reached an equilibrium at R star. And this corresponds to an investment point of I dash, or I star as well. Okay, so when the government borrows from the private sector, they are in a way competing with domestic savings, or the private sector for domestic savings. So they're competing with the private sector, so households and businesses, for domestic savings. Now to the government, this is a better option than to borrow from the RBA or to issue securities in order for the RBA to print more money, or to borrow overseas, which would require higher interest repayments, and which may also compromise our external stability. So what happens when the government borrows from the private sector? You must note this graph is the private sector. This relates to only the private sector. What happens is that the national savings line shifts to the left. So there is less national savings available for borrowing by the private sector. Now, as we can see, eventually the economy or the financial market will reach a new equilibrium. We're just going to call this R 1 and I1. And as we can see from the graph, the real interest rate, or the real interest rate, I should say, has increased from R star to R1. So there is a higher interest rate now. And the corresponding decrease in investment spending has actually decreased from I star to I1. So what this means is that although we can see that aggregate demand has been stimulated by the government, so aggregate demand equals C plus I plus G plus NX, we can see that this component of government spending has increased because of this budget deficit. Investment expenditure has decreased because of this crowding out effect, because the government has borrowed from the private sector and therefore pushed up the real interest rate, which would then discourage borrowing from the private sector. So this has actually decreased. And again, if we want to look at further expenditure by consumers, consumers would tend to actually depress their spending as well, because they don't have enough money for large purchases. So for example, the purchase of cars, when people have to borrow money, comes under consumption expenditure. This would also decrease. So people would tend to decrease their credit, or their application for credit, because of the high interest rate, and because they have to pay a higher rate of interest, and therefore that discourages consumption as well as investment expenditure. So although the government is trying to stimulate aggregate demand here, the converse has actually happened if the government uses or borrows from the private sector, in that it starts competing with the private sector for domestic savings, and as a result pushes the real interest rate up and depresses both investment expenditure, as seen on this graph, as well as consumption expenditure, because people are more wary that interest rates have gone up and therefore are less likely to spend. So there is a negative relationship between a budget deficit funded by borrowing from the private sector and stimulating aggregate demand.